Have you guys seen that tweet where somebody's mentioning how their roommate used to put powdered milk in his milk so he could have more milk per milk? First of all, that man is a national treasure and one of the greatest heroes of our generation, but also I think that Josef Fares might have met this dude at some point in his life and had an epiphany because his and Hazelight Studios' new game, It Takes Two, feels like more game per game than any game I've played before. It has so many mechanics, dips into so many genres, and balances so many ideas, all while somehow remaining cohesive, and after playing it, I wanted to dive a bit deeper into the methodology behind its co-op design. It's 5-minute rule, which isn't like some official thing that Hazelight has ever said about the game. It's just me making up a cool sounding name for It Takes Two's clear goal to introduce something new every few minutes while also being very tactical in terms of what is introduced and changed. This is something I noticed while playing the game, but through further research I found that it was actually more genius and multi-layered than I had originally thought, and I think it's an interesting topic to dive into, to explore why it was needed and why it worked so much, how it was incorporated, and how it was balanced throughout the game. So let's talk about the genius of It Takes Two's 5-minute rule. So this goofy ass book keeps mentioning over and over throughout the game how important collaboration is to your goal, and at the surface it's like, okay, yeah, we get it, stupid book, shut up, this is a co-op game, I understand, you don't have to tell me we have to work together. And right there is actually the issue with that statement. The book always says collaboration, not cooperation, and that choice of words I think is highly important because it actually encapsulates what Hazelight's overall objective was with this game. Cooperation is the process of working together to the same end. The only thing that needs to happen for something to be considered cooperation is you need to be working concurrently on things, you need to be aware of that fact, and the end goal has to be the same. You can technically work on two entirely basically unrelated parts of something as long as the end goal is the same. Collaboration is the action of working with someone to produce or create something. You need to be directly affecting each other more often. For example, if two people are trying to build a robot and one person works on the legs and the torso and the other works on the head and the arms, and then they throw them together at the end, that's in the realm of cooperation. Collaboration would more closely describe a situation where for each of those 4 parts, 2 people were working together. One's holding something open while the other person screws a couple things in. They communicate and try to find the best way to program joint movement software. Or even one person creates the mechanical elements and the other person works on the electrical connections and the code. Without the other person, both people's work is utterly useless. In my 5-sentence review of It Takes Two, I mentioned how the game makes you work together instead of makes you work beside each other, which is a very important goal for the project. Resistance 3, Destiny, Borderlands, Deep Rock Galactic, Sackboy, Remnant from the Ashes. I played all of these games co-op with my brother and a whole ton more, and all of them were almost always just playing through the game on our own, but at the same time. There are moments, especially when somebody goes down or we try to have one person focus on a boss and the other person focus on all the smaller enemies around that boss, where we have a burst of synergy, but it also feels like even though it would be harder, I have a chance to defeat the remaining enemies myself, or to take on the boss and everyone else on my own if this was a single player game and the difficulty was balanced as such. It Takes Two makes sure you're intertwined and need to rely on each other to get anything done. It's why the story works so well and why this game cannot be played in non-co-op. That's its whole identity. In fact, it's not a co-op game, it's a collab game. Look at this tiny section. Cody needs to make it to the other side, but the only way he can do that is if May hits this thing with her hammer, which opens up a platform for a split second that Cody needs to jump on to use to make it over. Now for May to make it over, she needs to hit this thing with her hammer again, Cody needs to use his nail to hold it in place, and then May can get across. Neither one of them on their own had the tools or the ability to make it to the other side, they needed each other to do it. Which is the whole point of the game, and it's reflected amazingly in the gameplay because neither my brother or I could also get through the game without working together. But as amazing as that is, there's an inherent issue with this system that Hazelight needed to deal with, and it has to do with an emotion you can feel all too often in co-op games. Frustration. My brother and I play a good handful of co-op games every year, and every game, without fail, we always get annoyed with each other like one time every hour. I can't believe you keep dying. Stop lagging behind, it's messing up my camera angle, which is why I died. If you friendly fire on me again, I will eat you. If that's how we feel with games where we have less of an immediate and direct impact on each other's actions and abilities, imagine how at each other's throats we'd be in a game where every action we made had an important effect on the other person. Except, here's the thing, we didn't get annoyed in It Takes Two. Somehow, Hazelight was able to develop a game that in theory should have led to me disowning my brother and him trying to sell my severed fingers online, but instead gave us our most frustration-free co-op experience of all time. In the next section of the video, let's see how they were able to do that by making constant hard left turns, which is the first building block of the game's 5-minute rule.
Make a right turn.
Really?
feel like John told me he was at the end of this road, but whatever, I trust you.
Take the exit on your right.
Okay, I feel like we're getting a bit off course, but maybe there's some construction back there, so...
Make a U-turn.
Okay, I must have misheard something. Maybe I was supposed to take the next exit or something.
Take the exit on your right.
Okay, no, see, now I know something's wrong. This is the exact opposite of where we should be. Oh,
on your right.
Okay, fine. Jesus, are you happy? God.
Make a hard left.
What?
Make a hard left.
I'm in the middle of the highway.
Make a hard left.
I would literally crash my car. There's a partition
here. Make a hard left.
I don't want to, okay?
Make a hard
stop
left.
asking me that.
Make a hard left.
Don't make me. I don't want to.
Make a hard left.
I'm so cute. One of the biggest praises thrown at It Takes Two is just how much it changes its mechanics, gives you new tools to play with, and feels like it's entirely changing what game you're playing, aka it takes a bunch of hard left turns. And while that does add to the general fun factor of the game, they also have a much deeper impact on its identity and its ability to keep both players satisfied and working as a unit. To talk about why that is, we need to get into the standard difficulty curve of video games. This is what I'd call a standard video game difficulty curve. It's not universal, but it's probably the most common one. As time increases, difficulty also increases, usually somewhat exponentially. Player skill is not as easy to quantify because it's such a variable, so you'll usually get some herky-jerky, generally upwards movement depending on the player and how difficult the game is. You might never run into a point where you're struggling, you might be kind of struggling the whole time and barely getting by most encounters or locations, or you'll get the hang of it at some points and the game gets the better of you at others. Frustration comes from when you're below that difficulty line, and the farther below you are, the more annoyed you get, but at least in a single player game, the only person you can be angry at is you. Or the game, because the game is stupid, and I definitely, listen, you have to believe me, dude. I pressed dodge at the right time, but it just didn't register. Like I hit the button. I definitely hit the button. But the hitbox, you have to believe me, okay? The second you introduce a second player into the mix, there's a potential for a problem, because all of a sudden, either one of you might be in a position where the game is playing more to your strengths, or you pick up faster than the other person, but with them lagging behind, it can seem really easy to feel like you're getting screwed over and should definitely be able to make it past the area you're at, but somebody isn't doing what they need to. Not only that, but if the skill disparity lasts for long enough sections of the game or the whole game, one player might feel very bored and the other might not feel very satisfied. I made a video on The Pedestrian recently and how much I loved it, and it's not a super tough game, it's a manageable puzzle game, most people can beat it, and recently I got my family to try and play it together, and they're all smart people, I think, and while at first they were discovering things and giving each other helpful tips or sharing their eureka moments, eventually it turned into talking over each other, some people not understanding why things would or wouldn't work, and then long awkward pauses after somebody got really mad at somebody else, and then somebody says, okay wait, give me the controller, and then they solve the puzzle. The more complicated the game got, the more disjointed the team became. If It Takes Two maintained its emphasis on collaboration while keeping anything resembling a normal game's difficulty curve, it wouldn't have been nearly as fun, engaging, or responsible for an enjoyable environment. So what it did instead is this. The thing is, the snapshot of time where two players' skills are the closest together is almost always at the beginning, especially if we don't include cases where one person is somebody who plays professionally 10 hours a day and the other person still calls a controller a remote. Like if we're talking people who somewhat regularly play games, they're almost definitely going to be the closest together in skill at that very beginning stage. This isn't just the case with games that have reasonable initial difficulties either. There's a reason that when Sekiro came out, basically everyone was getting pissed over the chained asshole. In general, it's that initial stretch of time where everyone's still figuring things out, discovering new tricks, getting a grip on the ideas and the mechanics, where you're on as similar a footing as possible. In making so many changes to the high-level gameplay so often, It Takes Two recreated that beginning of the game idea dozens of times. You never felt like the game was too easy, even though it never really spiked in difficulty, or frankly wasn't much more difficult at the end than it was at the beginning. Because it always felt like you were doing something new, learning something new about your powers or weapons, or finding unique ways to use them that had never shown up before, and also didn't show up very often afterwards. It always felt fresh because it always reset, took a hard turn, and then placed you back at the beginning while still having a story and interconnected ideas and general movement that laced everything together and made you feel like you were in fact moving forward, even if you did keep getting reset, so to speak. Both players were new to what the game was trying to do in the first hour, and both players were new to what the game was trying to do in the last hour. So you're hand in hand throughout and have an equal amount of chance to realize the solution to puzzles, think, hey wait a minute, do you think we're able to do this with these things, or figure out how to use unique abilities to make it across a certain area. And the second you might have started getting to a point where one person would pull away and your synergy would start getting thrown to the wayside, the game would change again and ensure that that didn't happen. So, what is the 5-minute rule this video is supposed to be about then, you might be asking? Well, like I said, this is the beginning of that idea. The 5-minute rule is the idea that the game needed to shake things up every 5 minutes to fulfill its goal perfectly. But hold up, the game changes up these high-level mechanics pretty often, but every 5 minutes seems like a little bit of an exaggeration, right? Well, yeah, those big mechanics, turning the game into a dungeon crawler, being able to manipulate time and teleport, your gravity boots and go big mode, they don't change every 5 minutes, which is actually good. They change closer to every 45 minutes to every hour and a half. But there are also a lot of low-level changes that make enough of an impact to keep the game fresh inside of those small slices of the game. And in this last section, we'll get into why those smaller changes were important and necessary and why the larger ones are the perfect size.
Alright, dude, are you ready?
Yeah, man, I was born ready.
Okay, sick.
Oh! Yeah, it got me.
Really?
You're wearing so many layers, I thought for sure it would have stopped it.
No, I got hit right in the sternum.
You're gonna have to take me to a hospital.
You know, maybe next time we should focus on clothes made out of wool. Maybe that was the mistake. I feel like that's like a little bit thicker, you know?
Oh god. Please.
Hey, do you have a really thick backpack we could try, maybe?
9 times out of 10, if somebody tries to make a game like It Takes Two, that game is gonna fail. It Takes Two is not a random assortment of unique mechanics, it's intelligently mapped out, paced, and executed so that each section feels fleshed out while also not feeling like they're overstaying their welcome. In the last section, we talked about why making so many large-scale changes was integral to the game's goal of creating a collaborative experience that didn't result in annoyance or large, unflattering sections of the experience. But there are still built-in issues with this approach that also needed to be addressed for the game to work. I brought up what I consider to be a standard difficulty curve for games just now, but just as important to this equation is a curve that represents the rate at which new things are being added to the game from a gameplay perspective, which is usually the inverse of the last one. Initially, you're learning all of the ropes of the game, so everything is new. You need to understand the basics and limitations of combat, traversal, dialogue options, everything. And as the game goes along, you start getting more and more equipment or are introduced to more changes, but the rate at which you get them or the significance that they have on your overall experience diminishes as time goes on, until you get close to the end where you've basically been given absolutely everything. And the game lets you sit with that for a while and then you use all of your tools against the toughest parts of the game. Again, this is not universal, but it's pretty common. Unlike the difficulty curve, you can't just take a sample of this graph and use it for every unique section of the game because then each section would feel incomplete. You can't take just the end because then it feels like you aren't progressing. You can't take just the middle because then the gameplay feels directionless, and you can't just take the beginning because then you have a situation where you get introduced to a whole bunch of new mechanics and you get cut way short. It'll basically feel like a demo of a game, and there's a reason my favorite VR game is Astrobot and not PlayStation VR Demo Disc 3, even though that game has a demo of Astrobot and a lot more. Demos are fun, but the whole point is that they're usually not satisfying on their own. Instead of taking parts of this experience, the whole curve needs to be truncated and ran through during each of the game's major sections, which is why we end up with the 5-minute rule. Things need to be constantly changing and evolving so that every single one of these experiences feel full and fleshed out while also giving us new things that we can do to make full use of the idea in limited time. But in order to do this without giving the player whiplash by like giving them big new changes every 5 minutes, making them feel like they're never comfortable with what's going on, the changes instead need to be layered on in a specific way. Essentially, and this part is pretty obvious, the changes that will make the biggest shifts to the game happen less frequently, though still at a steady pace, and the smaller changes are allowed to occur way faster than they do in a typical game because of the shortened overall time frame of this curve and the fact that it won't throw constant huge wrenches at the player. Let's explore how this layering works because I think it's actually pretty interesting. The top layer is the basic movement, traversal, and combat of the game, and this is one that's kept almost entirely the same throughout, with a couple of very small sections switching it up a bit. Most of the time, whether you got magnets, a mini time machine, or a hammer and a nail, your basic movement is the same no matter what. Running, sprinting, jumping, dashing, same animations, same logic, same controls. The game transforms every hour or so, but it's also important to not change it at its absolute core because then the player can ground themselves in a constant instead of feeling like everything is random bullshit. The next layer is these settings and abilities, which change every 1 to 2 hours, and that number is based off of the timestamps on the full game playthrough on the gameplay only channel. These are the biggest changes to the game, so they're not super frequent, although they are way more frequent than basically any other game out there, as is the rest of the stuff we're about to get into. Here's a picture of a little timeline I made of the tree section of the game, and again, this is based on that gameplay only video. And you can see that in order to make sure that 5 minutes never pass without something new happening, there needed to be a specific frequency of changes to multiple layers of the game. The story and visuals obviously changed the least frequently since they were key parts to what actually constitutes this section. It makes no sense to go from the tree to like space with the same sap gun, so those things were kind of our anchors. The gameplay changed at an almost constant tempo and a bit more often because it had more wiggle room and ability to tackle multiple ideas within this section as opposed to the previous two things. Although there was a common thread along most of those changes, for example, these four, where the first is the introduction of these sap and fire guns and using them in the world and in puzzles. The second is now using those weapons for combat purposes. The third changes our movement to on-rail sliding instead of free motion on our feet but keeps the same weapons in combat. And the fourth uses the sap gun to steer a boat in dangerous waters. And like I said, that common thread of the sap gun helps anchor us despite the quick changes. Enemy types and significant puzzle variations like using sap to just bring bridges down and bring them back up versus using it to control another person's platforming versus applying it to clasps to unhinge them were the most frequently changed. They didn't happen all the time, but when they did, it was with some crazy fast speed one after another. Unique applications of similar ideas. That clasp puzzle shows up one time. That weighted platforming shows up like 3 times total, and they're so different from one another. We're getting something new with each instance, but because they also had a lot of things in common, changing them quickly doesn't feel abrupt or disorienting. Each individual segment doesn't change every 5 minutes, but layered together they do, and that's the way that it needed to be approached because all of these ideas now have room to breathe and feel complete despite the wicked fast pace of everything. When I said 9 out of 10 times that someone would try to make a game that changed around this much, it would fail, the reason why is the pace and layering of changes needs to be done in a very precise way. If the game tried to change its larger layers too much, say one section was a platformer, the next was a shooter, the next was a puzzler, and the next was a melee, or even one of these smaller sections went from a spacecraft shooter, then 5 minutes later went to a top-down shooter, then 5 minutes later it was an FPS, and another 5 minutes later it was a slow Resident Evil-like third-person shooter, that's still a whole bunch of ideas crammed into a small space, but it seems like random BS more than a structured video game, much less a well-paced one. It Takes Two makes big strides when needed, but it settles for small but significant steps layered between a few different elements in order to make its brilliant ideas work. I always think back to this one quick puzzle in that tree area, where you have to use this sap gun and make a trail in order to reach something that May can't see so she can explode it, and how any other game would have reused that trail idea in a more complicated way to expand on it fully. But here it just does it once and it never shows up again. It showed it, it got its oh I get it moment out of you, it felt like a new use of the sap gun, and then it just moved on. But it still felt like we were covering more ground with the sap gun idea with every new puzzle that was introduced, including that one. Hell, I didn't even include in my timeline things like puzzles that are functionally similar but have clear visual and technical differences in order to seem unique. It's genuinely almost impossible to figure out how any team could make a game like this, so full of ideas but never feeling rushed or overcrowded. And at the end of all of this, all I can say is thank God they did. And that Hazelight Studios has almost instantly become a studio that can't be ignored and has the potential to push video games to their absolute limits, and I really hope that they do. Thank you guys for watching. If you're new and you enjoyed the video, hit the sub button. The channel's still super small and these videos take a lot of time, so if you watched all the way to the end and you want to help support what I do, that'd be super appreciated. Leave your thoughts on the video or on the game in general below. I'd love to hear what you think, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Peace.